In the last Pinpoint episode, we applied the decoy effect of behavioral economics to contemporary politics in India and considered uh, the possibility of Indian polity taking a sharp turn even further to the left. We then took a different approach and tried to understand the underlying philosophy of the modern Indian Republic, that is, liberalism, and reached a similar conclusion about the future or even the present of our society. Some people may have felt that the mention of totalitarianism was a gross exaggeration on my part, because as the media never fails to remind us, we are a vibrant democracy, as is evident from the noise on our TV screens and in the Holy Parliament. Before we proceed, I want to take a moment to address a couple of points that we receive as persistent feedback from some followers. I want to clarify upfront that Upward is primarily an English content producer. And that is why we have launched Chakshu Media, where we are slowly building a parallel civilizational discourse in Hindi. Those of you who want the same kind of intellectually stimulating content in Hindi, please subscribe to Chakshu Media. The link is provided in the description below. Second, I must add the disclaimer that the Pinpoint series is meant to convey complex ideas by design. We will have many sessions of elaborate discussions on these topics on the Uprising app, YouTube, Twitter Spaces, and Clubhouse to help our subscribers understand these ideas better. But please bear with the complexity of the arguments in this Pinpoint series, as we believe it is a necessary first step. Back to us being a vibrant democracy. As many people imagine, that is supposed to be the antithesis of totalitarianism, this being a vibrant democracy. Now, there are two misconceptions here. One, that our democracy is vibrant, and two, that totalitarianism cannot take root in modern democracies. So let's deal with each of these misconceptions one by one. The way in which modern education has imprisoned our imagination is reflected very sharply in our political beliefs. And one of those beliefs is that democracy is a modern phenomenon. It is an embarrassing indictment of our education system that many of us think that before electoral democracy with universal suffrage came to dominate what we call the free world, ordinary people had no say in politics. This is a naive and erroneous view that not only caricatures the past, but also limits our understanding of the present by inflating our sense of self-righteousness, which to me is the defining characteristic of the cults of modernity and progress. This belief that we know much better than the savages who lived before us. The fact of the matter is that the history of politics, for as far back as we can see, is a grand democratic experiment. For the ruler always depends on the consent of the subjects. And he turns into a despot only when socioeconomic conditions allow for political power to be turned against its very source, which is the people. In other words, a healthy and reasonably well-functioning society has the capacity to rein in the powers of a potential despot. And in that sense, despotism is a bottom-up phenomenon, because the very idea of leadership is a bottom-up phenomenon. Unless, of course, if it has been hijacked, which is also not very uncommon. So, as I was saying, the history of politics is a grand experiment in democracy. In India, we see an ebb and flow of democratic power across history. as K.P. Jaiswal notes in his book Hindu Polity, the Vedic age was monarchical, but with a strong democratic spirit, by way of a participation of the whole people in public affairs through samitis that were even responsible for electing the king. Parallelly, there were sabhas working under the samitis, and these were more concerned with the judicial aspects of governance. The post-Vedic age began with all kinds of experiments and led to a flowering of Hindu republics governed by elected representatives as opposed to monarchs. The age of republics lasted well over 1,000 years and gave way to the mighty empires of pre-Islamic India. Anyway, the history of republican polity and its rise and fall is out of scope of this talk, but I just want to draw your attention to the fact that democracy has existed as long as Hindu civilization has existed. And why just Hindu civilization? The democratic instinct, if I may call it that, is not new to the West too. The Germanic tribes elected their kings, just like the Vedic people did. So did the French and the Scandinavian people. The oldest parliament in the Western world, which is the Icelandic Althing, if I'm pronouncing it right, was established in the year 930 of the Common Era. We know about the Republic of Athens and so on. So this whole idea of democracy being a modern accomplishment is not exactly tenable. Elan de Benoit writes in his book The Problem of Democracy, the vast majority of political regimes throughout history can actually be classed as mixed. Now, the modernist claim is that liberal democracy is the purest form of democracy, in which the government is truly of the people, by the people, and for the people. This it achieves through universal suffrage, or one man, one vote. The great George Orwell observed, and I quote, "The defenders of every kind of regime claim that it is a democracy." In 1957, Giovanni Sartori noted, in a somewhat paradoxical vein, democracy could be defined as a high-flown name for something which does not exist. Now, why did these political thinkers make such pessimistic comments even as they lived in post-war Europe, not under some despotic regime in sub-Saharan Africa or North Korea? Didn't every person in 20th century England and Italy have voting rights? And weren't elections held every few years to refresh the mandate of the populace? Indeed, that is the case. But they made such statements because they saw through the farce of reducing the concept of democracy to elections. Now, what does that mean? Let us go back to the basics again. And since India is a passive recipient of liberal democracy, we must turn to Western Enlightenment philosophers to understand what the term really means. Liberal democracy is an interesting phrase. It encompasses two contradictory concepts: liberalism and democracy. Liberals strongly endorse democracy along with a broad acceptance of things like free market, free trade, freedom of speech, secularism, etc., etc. But at the core of liberalism is an almost fanatic belief in individualism. This unwavering commitment to individualism puts liberalism in a tight spot when it comes to its professed love of democracy, which is basically a form of government and collective action. Thomas Paine captures this conflict succinctly when he writes, "Government, even in its best state, is a necessary evil." This need to resolve the conflict between government authority and individual liberty led to the idea of separation of powers in liberal democracies, basically leading to the distribution of authority between legislature, executive, and judiciary, and also placing constitutional checks and balances in the process. Now, what are the objectives of the Republic of India as stated in the preamble to the Constitution? Justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity. Ignore justice for the purpose of analysis. We have liberty sandwiched between equality and fraternity. Equality is the clearest expression of the individualistic spirit of liberalism, which I was talking about a moment ago. Meaning that if the individual is the fundamental political unit, then it is necessary to accept the egalitarian dogma that all men are born equal. This gets really interesting. The etymological root of election is the same as that of the word elite, elegere, which is to choose. So the act of choosing is itself opposed to the idea of egalitarianism, because obviously choosing implies that some men are better than others, at least as far as political leadership is concerned. Okay, leave that aside. Now, let's talk about liberty, around which there is a lot of confusion in our times. Liberty is an abstract noun and must be conceptually pinned down to properly understand what it stands for. Liberty can either be defined in relation to equality or fraternity, not both at the same time. In the former case, when you are defining it in relation to equality, the pursuit of liberty leads to atomization of society, as the individual is considered to be the basic political unit. In the framework of fraternity, liberty is the freedom of an individual to participate in communal life, the freedom to play his role, whatever that may be, in the community or fraternity that he belongs to. The individual here is not inherently equal to others, just as the goalkeeper is not equal to the center forward in a football team. This is an aspect of reality unpalatable to Christian sensibilities that inform the moral attitude of the modern masses. Before people go on to label me casteist or whatever, as some comments in the last video did, I must hasten to add that the opposite of egalitarianism is not oppression based on inequality, which is an abhorrent thought in itself. But what it is interdependence and pluralism. So here is the crux of what I have said so far. Liberal democracy, by virtue of its egalitarian and individualistic agenda, leads to an atomized society in which individuals grow more and more isolated because the legal and political systems actively work to destroy community life. The only communities that survive and maintain some degree of autonomy are those that go against the tide and become hostile to the state. That is precisely why a certain religious minority, the Samuday Vishesh, anywhere in the world, becomes a challenge for the liberal state and eventually becomes the beneficiary of appeasement politics that we are so familiar with in India. Those who comply with the dogmas of liberalism, like Hindus, end up being collectively dysfunctional to the extent that they are not even allowed to manage their own temples. So much for vibrant democracy. Now, let us go to the second misconception that I mentioned. That is the misconception that democracy precludes the possibility of totalitarianism. This is again a belief that comes from an incorrect understanding of totalitarianism. Liberal democracies give way to one of the two kinds of totalitarian systems, hard or soft. Hard totalitarianism is, of course, when a fascist or a communist ideologue gets elected due to his irrepressible charm. Soft totalitarianism is more insidious, pervasive, and long term. It takes birth in perfectly democratic settings. Totalitarianism, as the name suggests, is a phenomenon that aims to encompass the totality of a citizen's social life by forcing him to conform to an ideology that tolerates no dissent. A totalitarian regime wants to control virtually all aspects of social life, including the moral sense of citizens. In case you're looking for evidence for such an attempt in India, look no further than Sabrimala, where the state wanted to impose an alien morality on millions of devotees of Swami Ayyappa just because their beliefs did not conform to the dogmas of the religion of secularism. This is an example of democratic totalitarianism. There is much to be said about democratic totalitarianism, which we can cover in future episodes as well. But the point to be noted here is this. Soft totalitarianism, in itself a highly toxic and corrosive phenomenon, inevitably leads to hard totalitarianism. A while ago, I talked about the atomization of society in liberal democracies. In one of the most remarkable works of scholarship on the topic, which is The Origins of Totalitarianism, author Hannah Arendt notes, and I quote, "The truth is that the masses grew out of the fragments of a highly atomized society whose competitive structure and concomitant loneliness of the individual had been held in check only through membership in a class." Unquote. Here the word masses carries a specific meaning. It means a large collection of individuals who do not belong to any group or community based on religion or values or common interests. Basically, deracinated folks that are mass produced by the Indian education system. It is the masses that flock to totalitarian leaders because they pretend to have the cure for their lonely and pointless existence. As you can see, in India, it is only and only the Hindu religion that acts as an obstacle to the spread of this disease among the religious majority. If you had any doubts about how Hinduism keeps India together, here is your answer. But anyway, I will not delve on the problems further because there's already a lot to process. But as promised, I will end with what I think are the solutions, or at least the direction in which we must look for solutions. Some of these ideas may appear controversial and unpalatable, but I will make an effort to dive deeper into each of these points in future videos. The agenda is quite straightforward and can be summed up as the rebuilding of Hindu community life. The focus should be on freeing the Hindu mind from the tyranny of economism and consumerism that has replaced the four Purusharthas as the goals of human life. This would entail, with or without cooperation of political parties, the following. 1. Dharma is the supreme aim of life and cannot be made to serve political and ideological agendas. Accordingly, we must work to free Hindu temples from state control and hand them back to their sampradayas and communities. Number 2, centralized justice institutions are a tool of totalitarianism. We must strengthen community justice forums like Khap Panchayats, as has happened successfully in various post-colonial societies across the world that have started to take control of their own destiny. Number 3, reject the social engineering projects around caste. These projects have been designed purely for political purposes, and not just political purposes in a higher sense, but for purposes of winning elections. Jati is a natural extension of family. Annihilation of Jati is another name for destroying bonds of kinship and is a sure shot recipe for the atomization of society. Number 4, protect our natural heritage through a step-by-step decolonization of law that leads to the proliferation of commons. We are a polytheistic society with reverence for nature at the heart of our consciousness. And unless we regain our intimacy with nature, no amount of political struggle can save us from extinction. Number 5, decolonization cannot just stop at law and jurisprudence. We need an overhaul of the education system that reflects our commitment to dharma. If the state does not fund such efforts, say due to Article 28 of the Constitution, nothing prevents Hindus from starting their own educational institutions and boards, like the Christians did with the ICSE. Number 6, take up the responsibility of self-defense. Do not outsource it to the state. Remember that we are dealing with an enemy, or with enemies who are ruthless in their approach and have the state under their thumb. Number 7, all these are but steps towards establishing a Hindu civilizational state free from any kind of Abrahamic influence. Dissolve the Ministry of Minority Affairs and any of such structures and policies that strengthen Abrahamism in our society. Hindu values must be re-established at the core of all state apparatuses. And number 8, none of the points I have mentioned would be possible without scaling up intellectual efforts by setting up and funding top-notch institutions like think tanks, academic institutions, and research centers of the kind that produce world-class scholarship. Think something like the Hoover Institution and Matsushita Institute of Government and Management in Japan, for example. As mentioned earlier, we will explore each of these points in much more depth in future episodes of Pinpoint. But to those who usually say that we only point out problems and never talk about solutions at Upward, let us see what you will do if you agree with even just one of the 8 points that I listed. The ball is in your court now. Until next time.